Thank you. Okay, so although I had a title, this is a different title. It's the same thing, really. This is a presentation mainly about a project called Reclaim the Lanes, which started off as a community project. And then we received some funding with Nigel's support and a letter of support from the university, from the ESRC, for some impact acceleration work. So I've been lucky enough to be on a secondment to the Chat Trust, which is an organisation within Wingrove for the last, between February and May, working on existing community development work and trying to build it into something else. So the name of the project is Advocacy Through Environmental Change, and it's really got two aims. One of them is an aim for sort of direct environmental change, and then the other one is the more advocacy aim of action research into the systems of service provision and the kind of things that directly affect people's lives where they live. So there's a research element to it in that sense, from an advocacy perspective. I was going to read you some of this. I think it's probably easier to explain it. So a lot of my motivation for coming to this way of trying to approach research, I should say I joined Greening Wingrove board and approached them in February of 2014, so I've also been active as a volunteer, as a director on the board, and I'm a local resident. So I have a few different hats. And I have a few different interests for being involved. But one of my particular interests was a feeling that we need to start to divine a different way of approaching planning. And I feel that we've got an increasingly mired in a kind of a neoliberal taken for granted status quo about releasing the market and planners getting out of the way, which isn't a controversial thing to say. But the backlash to that often comes in terms of reinventing some of the older approaches and maybe more modernistic approaches to bureaucratic planning, liberal approaches that we've been used to before we've had this huge neoliberal onslaught and deregulation of our system. And I wonder if we're not going through a kind of slightly stagnant argument between these two approaches, rather than taking some of the more libertarian influences that Simin introduced this morning and seeing if they can be developed into something a bit more progressive, or something that, in the unfortunately unlikely event that we would have maybe a more left-wing government in the future, would then help them to take on some of those ideas and avoid some of the problems that have been mentioned around New Deal for Communities, top-down, targets-driven regeneration in the past. So this is a quote I like from Hugh Ellis at the Town and Country Planning Association. I think he summed up my feelings and motivation quite well. So, we in the profession and those in academia risk being like flies on a corpse, merrily conducting a post-mortem on a body which once sustained our activities. Critical analysis is vital, but it's not enough. And this is where I feel that action research is something that maybe can contribute additionally to the critical analysis that people are doing. I think the debates around Brexit and being quite active on Facebook recently have really made me feel that unfortunately our democracy seems to be in very poor health, and the level of misinformation that seems to be around in society is huge. And so we potentially have this disconnect where we have an academic head that's fairly well resourced to think about things, but totally unable to then implement any of those ideas because we have such a vociferous tabloid press. So we need to find a way of bridging that gap and finding new ways of doing things. In order to try to bridge that gap, I think it's think of some of the ideas of Jane Hillier here about trying to take the popular discourses and work with them rather than battle against them and hark back to liberal modernistic ways of doing planning. So these are a couple of sort of fairly inspirational starting points. So Leiden and Garcia's book on tactical urbanism talks about the use of objects and direct environmental interventions as a way of, in their view, advocating for people who are not well provided by services. Later I've come to Kelvin Campbell, Massive Small, the idea that lots and lots of small interventions can actually, and maybe more informal interventions, can actually add up to a much bigger change than trying to do it than an over-controlled bureaucratic process that spends ages debating about something before finally landing the great big multi-million-pound infrastructure project or whatever it might be. So there are these arguments for small, more informal, maybe more libertarian ways of doing things. And I think that the problem with these arguments is sometimes that they become divorced from the politics which sits beneath this. And there is a range of politics, as we've seen. There's a spectrum of libertarian politics that you could place some of these different approaches on. God, this is an annoying thing. So as I said, Saul Alinsky, going back to sort of community organising techniques, is saying that is pointing out some of these problems of being stifled in action. Liberals sit calmly, dispassionately studying the issue, but nothing really happens. The radical sees injustice and strikes at it with hot passion. Similarly, Leiden Garcia are saying, and Kelvin Campbell are saying, that tactical urbanism, massive small, are ways of getting things done, particularly in an environment where there's a weak private sector. You could break them down into a spectrum, which we don't have time to go into great detail. But rather than see some of these ideas as tactical urbanism, in my view, becoming sort of a professionalised urban design practice for an environment where we don't have large private sector players chomping at the bit to build things, you could have them in the middle. You could have more advocacy-based, community organising-based approaches somewhere there. Neil Brenner has talked about joining up cooperative approaches to planning with various tiers of state-led planning as an alternative to neoliberalism. Others have criticised some of these approaches as being right-wing, as being just a new way to persuade the government to accept development from large private sector players, and as paternalistic top-down attempts to change behaviours. So it's important to be aware when doing these things of these different things you can fall into. This is a Guardian photograph submitted by one of the PhD students here, Goran Nafani, showing some of the issues that Nigel talked about earlier. This is back lane in the Wingrove area, and the theme of the submission was mess, and this was what he submitted. This is the muse, if you like, for thinking through some of the tactical urbanism advocacy issues that I talked about. That's possibly a less, well, I don't know if it's less messy, but it's not quite so much license on that. But that shows a back lane that we've been working in as a sort of baseline starting picture. As Nigel was saying, rather than attack litter directly, we thought it would be nice to try to encourage some sort of pride initially into changing the environment directly. And this, I think, was influential. This is Vancouver's green lanes that Nigel mentioned, semi-permeable surfacing. And also, almost as a byproduct of doing this to tackle flooding in Vancouver, led to more community activity. So it's an example of direct environmental change in back lanes, and this is Longford Street in Middlesbrough, which is actually next to an area that they demolished because there was low demand. So this isn't as simple as some of the gentrification academics would sort of make out, but an amazing change that they've community-led change they've managed to deliver. So the Reclaim the Lanes project started off as a volunteer resident project, as I said. We had a number of street parties. We had 8 street parties funded by the lottery. I think that might be Nigel there. I'm the one with the silly hat on. We just did various activities to try and attract people to use the back lane and turn what could be quite a hostile environment, if you think of that sort of imagery that a lot of people have, and also teenagers shouting and singing in groups down the street that some people find very intimidating, into a space with a very different atmosphere, with the aim of then possibly building onto that environmental changes. So we ran that all through for a full year time in the summer and warmer months, and we had local bands from the youth centre, the Chat Trust, playing in the space, mostly out of the Czech or Slovak Roma teenagers. And then the secondment then tried to add on to that some activities to directly change the environment. As you can see here, this is some sort of murals and things like this. So they're quite low-key stuff. They're not fancy. They're not going to save the world really in themselves. But what we did was an exploratory process of trying out things, reflecting every one or two times, trying something different, thinking about how people reacted to these things, what their behavioural signals was, talking, anecdotal conversations, trying to build them into the design of further activities. And the street parties acted as a spine against which we could then try to work with particular different stakeholders and groups in the area to try to identify, strike a deal with them really, as to what would interest them and what we could engage them into doing. So we went on a climbing trip. This is some of them painting this wall white, which is in the youth centre, and then the little kids getting involved. And partly this was an attempt to address some of the lack of involvement of these particular sort of ethnic communities in the Greening Ringgrove initiative, and ending with this sort of co-designed, co-produced mural, which is like the centrepiece on the street that will then be, there are then other interventions like planters and things coming down the street. So all that's very nice, and we're starting to make some some progress in terms of changing the feel of the street. But we're probably making more progress in terms of the community and how they perceive the street, whether things get vandalised, and how people come together as a group. How much time have I got? Do you know?
1 minute.
1 minute, right. So these are some principles that we've been working on. Getting away from planning, this top-down big planning process, where you debate the plan and then do action, but doing things first, then looking to see what people's reactions are, trying to adapt, doing it again. Encouraged appropriation. Some things very, very driven by us. People start to feel the rhythm of things as they go along. Now they expect street parties to happen in the space, and there's a great deal of anticipation. And now, having got a translator last week, we've went from a situation of a very, very guarded, defensive community with racism around it, to actually having them coming forward and asking to be interviewed and give their views, and people wanting now to put on events as part of the street parties. So we're now actually starting to see those people driving the process to some extent, and we hope to then use that across a language barrier. No, I don't speak Slovakian, they don't speak English at all, to help them to organise within their community and bring forward to represent their communities and bring forward their issues. I'm probably out of time, but okay. Yes, I am out of time to go into that stuff. But one of the big differences about this approach being an advocacy approach is that we're looking to strike deals with people and then bring forward and get people to autonomously come forward with their own issues, and to build out action through the community in that way and on people's own terms. So it's only driven enough as we have to make it happen, which differs very much from things like nudge theory, libertarian paternalism, which define how people need to behave to begin with, and then try to use various surreptitious techniques to get them, to engineer them to behave in line with those things. And the big difference that's now coming out of this, just at the moment, is what people are saying about litter. Effectively, the systems don't match with their lifestyles. So people think that there is a charge for replacement wheelie bins. Wheelie bins are all stolen. People don't actually have any capacity to put their waste in anything. The street bins are all overflowing, and the reason for that is because there's nowhere to. It's actually very difficult for people to behave in the way that the systems set up tell them they should behave in a certain correct way. It's virtually impossible for people who don't speak English to do that. And when enforcement officers come in, they find themselves in this grey, muddy area. Who is deliberately being antisocial, throwing, tipping stuff in back lanes? Who is trying but is still breaking the rules? And they're trying to adopt a zero tolerance approach, and it's basically impossible for them. So the two things coming over the hill for the council are more enforcement and more communal bins, which have been. It's a service that's been designed without the research into whether they will work in these particular circumstances. Been designed on research in areas where people predominantly speak English, and there's a potential to create ways of delivering those services actually work for people where they can actually use them, and then that will make enforcement a much easier thing to do. So that's where we're getting to at the moment.
Thank you, Lee. Thanks. We'll go to our third speaker in this session, Julia Heslop, and hopefully we'll